question about Miquella that haunts every player who ventures into the shadow of the Erdtree is simple yet profoundly complex. Was Miquella a hero trying to save a broken world through compassion? Or was he a master manipulator, using his divine charm to bend reality to his will? The answer, as with most things in the lands between, lies somewhere in the shadows, between light and dark. The Cursed Empyrean. To understand Miquella's master plan, we must first understand the being who conceived it. Miquella was born alongside his twin sister, Malenia, children of a single god. Their parentage is unique, even among the demigods, born of Marika and Radahn, who are themselves one and the same being. This union of a single deity with itself produced two Empyreans, beings chosen by the Two Fingers as potential successors to Queen Marika herself. But this divine birth came with a terrible price. While Malenia was cursed with the scarlet rot that would plague her entire existence, Miquella bore a curse perhaps even more insidious: eternal childhood. He would never grow, never age, never mature beyond the form of a young child, regardless of how many years passed or how much wisdom he accumulated. The nascent butterfly item description tells us that these butterflies are drawn to the discarded skin of demigods, and that those who follow Miquella glow with a rainbow of light. This imagery of transformation denied becomes a recurring theme throughout Miquella's story. From his earliest days, Miquella displayed an intelligence and capability far beyond his apparent years. The description of the golden epitaph sword tells us that Miquella crafted this blade as a prayer for his brother Godwyn, hoping that he might achieve a true death and be freed from his undead torment. This act of compassion, creating a weapon of gold to grant peace to a suffering sibling, established Miquella's reputation as the kindest of all the demigods. But there was something else about Miquella, something that went beyond mere intelligence or compassion. He possessed an ability that made even other demigods wary. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, speaks of her brother with reverence. According to Gideon Ofnir, Malenia claimed that Miquella is the most fearsome Empyrean of all. This is not a description of physical might. Malenia herself held that title, having never known defeat until her battle with Radahn. No, this fearsome quality was something else entirely. The bewitching branch item description provides our first real glimpse into this power. These silver branches are said to be a charm used in an ancient temple, and the practice of sharing them is a ritual of building trust. Yet when used, they can temporarily compel former foes to become allies. The description notes that Miquella once glimpsed the form of an Empyrean in fleeting visions, suggesting these branches were connected to his own nature and abilities. Miquella's childhood was spent in study and experimentation. He delved deeply into the principles of Golden Order fundamentalism, seeking to understand the very laws that governed reality. Unlike many of his siblings who pursued martial might or political power, Miquella sought knowledge. He studied the Elden Ring itself, understanding its constituent parts and how they interlocked to form the current order of the world. It was during this period that Miquella made perhaps the most significant discovery, the secret of unalloyed gold. Standard gold in the lands between was a conduit for the greater will's influence, imbued with the essence of the Erdtree and the Golden Order. But Miquella discovered a way to purify gold, to remove this influence and create something pure and unalloyed. This golden substance had remarkable properties. It could resist the influence of outer gods themselves. The practical applications were immediately apparent. If unalloyed gold could resist outer gods, perhaps it could resist the scarlet rot that plagued his beloved sister. The various needles Miquella crafted tell a story of desperate attempts to save Melania from her curse. He created needles of unalloyed gold, delicate instruments that could be inserted directly into the body to stave off the rot's advancement. The description of the unalloyed gold needle states that Miquella embedded these needles in his own flesh to ward away the meddling of outer gods. These weren't cures, but they bought time. They provided relief. They gave hope. But Miquella's ambitions extended far beyond helping his sister. If unalloyed gold could resist outer gods, it could potentially free the lands between from the greater will's dominance entirely. It represented a third path, not submission to the Golden Order, nor descent into chaos and outer god worship, but true independence. This discovery became the foundation of everything that followed. The young Empyrean also demonstrated remarkable skill in crafting. The Miquella's needle, which can be used to reverse the flame of frenzy, shows his ability to create items of profound power. The description tells us that this needle can forestall the flame of frenzy if used in the heart of the storm beyond time, a specific and challenging requirement that speaks to the precision of Miquella's work. He wasn't just a theorist or a dreamer. He was a craftsman who could bring his visions into reality. During this period, Miquella also developed what would become known as Golden Order fundamentalism, though this attribution is somewhat debated. What we know for certain is that he created incantations that blended faith and intelligence, requiring both to cast effectively. The description of several fundamentalist incantations reference the work of both Miquella and the scholar Radahn, suggesting collaboration or parallel research. Either way, Miquella's intellectual contributions to understanding and manipulating the laws of the Golden Order were substantial. But perhaps most importantly, during these formative years, Miquella began to understand the true nature of the world he lived in. He saw the suffering caused by the Golden Order's rigid hierarchies. He witnessed the persecution of the Omen, twins like Morgott and Mohg, cast into sewers simply for being born with horns. He observed the mistreatment of the misbegotten, the oppression of the Albinarics, the rejection of all those who didn't fit the Golden Order's narrow definition of acceptable life. And somewhere in those observations, in that accumulation of knowledge about suffering and injustice, Miquella conceived his grand vision. He would create a new order, one built not on might or divine mandate, but on compassion. He would build a haven for all the rejected and suffering peoples of the lands between. He would cure the curses that afflicted those he loved. He would ascend and become a god himself, not to impose his will through force, but to spread an age of compassion across the world. It was a beautiful vision. The question we must grapple with is what Miquella was willing to do to achieve it, and whether the methods he chose betrayed the very compassion he claimed to champion. The Erdtree Sanctuary. Miquella's first major project, and perhaps the clearest expression of his stated ideals, was the creation of the Erdtree. This was no small undertaking. The Erdtree was to be nothing less than an alternative to the Erdtree itself, a new world tree that could serve as the foundation for a different kind of order in the lands between. The description of items found throughout the Erdtree region tells us that Miquella watered this tree with his own blood. The sacramental bud description explicitly states that these buds bloomed on the Erdtree, which Miquella cultivated with his own sacred blood. This wasn't a metaphor or legend. Miquella literally poured his life essence into this tree, nurturing it from a sapling into something that could rival the Erdtree itself. The effort this required cannot be overstated. For years, perhaps decades, Miquella bled himself to feed this tree. The physical toll alone would be immense, but for an Empyrean whose body was locked in eternal childhood, the sacrifice was even greater. Every drop of blood represented not just pain, but a portion of his limited physical capacity. Yet Miquella persisted, driven by his vision of what the Erdtree could become. And slowly, miraculously, it grew. The tree that would come to be known as the Erdtree rose in Miquella's domain, its golden boughs spreading wide. The Erdtree knight armor description tells us that these knights were devoted defenders of the tree, viewing service to it and to Miquella as the highest honor. The settlement that grew around and within the tree became a haven for those rejected by the Golden Order. The Albinarics, artificial life forms persecuted and hunted throughout the lands between, found sanctuary here. The description of the Ripple Blade, a weapon used by Albinaric warriors, mentions that many Albinarics made the treacherous journey to the Erdtree seeking shelter. The fact that they undertook such dangerous pilgrimages speaks to how desperate their situation was elsewhere, and how much hope they placed in Miquella's promised sanctuary. The misbegotten, creatures treated as little more than beasts by the Golden Order, also found acceptance at the Erdtree. Throughout the game, we see misbegotten enslaved and forced to labor in various locations, but at the Erdtree, they lived as citizens, even serving as warriors in defense of their home. The acceptance extended to them represented a fundamental rejection of the Golden Order's rigid categorization of life into worthy and unworthy forms. Even the Omen, perhaps the most persecuted group in all the lands between, could theoretically find acceptance here. While we don't encounter many Omen at the Erdtree itself, the philosophy underlying the sanctuary was clear. All were welcome, regardless of how they were born or what curses they bore. This stood in stark contrast to the Golden Order, which cast Omen children into sewers and considered their very existence a stain on society. But the Erdtree was more than just a refugee camp or sanctuary. Miquella envisioned it as the foundation for a new order entirely. The tree itself was meant to eventually mature into something that could challenge the Erdtree's dominance. The description of the Eclipse Shotel provides a crucial detail about another of Miquella's projects during this time. The weapon references a sun that is worn and dull, and speaks of prayers for the return of their eclipse. This connects to Castle Sol, where Miquella conducted rituals attempting to bring about an eclipse. Why an eclipse? The answer lies in Miquella's continued efforts to help his siblings. His brother Godwyn had died in Sol during the Night of the Black Knives, but his body lived on, corrupting and spreading those who live in death throughout the lands. The Golden Epitaph sword tells us that Miquella prayed for Godwyn to die a true death, but prayers alone weren't sufficient. Miquella needed to actively intervene. The connection between eclipses and death in Elden Ring's lore suggests that Miquella believed an eclipse could grant Godwyn the true death he needed. The various items found at Castle Sol, including the Eclipse Shotel and the Mausoleum Soldier Ashes, reference failed attempts to call down this eclipse. The eclipse never came, and Godwyn remained trapped in his undead state. But the effort itself reveals Miquella's genuine desire to help those he loved. During this period, Miquella also continued his work on the unalloyed gold needles. The various iterations of these needles found throughout the game show a progression in his understanding and technique. The base unalloyed gold needle could slow the progression of the Scarlet Rot. When combined with materials from Malenia's boss fight, it could be repaired and strengthened. Eventually, it could even become Miquella's needle, capable of warding outer gods entirely. These needles represented Miquella's continued dedication to curing his sister's affliction. Malenia herself speaks of waiting for Miquella's return, trusting that her brother would find a way to break both their curses. The description of Malenia's prosthetic arm and blade tell us that Miquella personally crafted these for his sister, using his skill to help her function despite the rot eating away at her body. These were acts of genuine care and love, not manipulation or control. The Erdtree also becomes a center of religious devotion, though not to the greater will. The various prayer books and incantations found in the region reference prayers to Miquella himself, or to Saint Trina, who we now know was another aspect of Miquella. The Erdtree prayer room became a place where the faithful could gather and worship their chosen god to be, free from the strictures of the Golden Order. But there was a darker side to all this apparent benevolence. The very power that allowed Miquella to attract so many followers, that drew the persecuted and downtrodden to his banner, was the same charm ability we discussed earlier. How many of the Erdtree's defenders chose to serve Miquella freely, and how many found themselves compelled by his innate nature? The Cleanrot Knights, elite warriors who showed fanatical devotion even after Miquella's disappearance, raise particular questions. Their loyalty persisted through millennia's rot blooming in Caelid, through the horror of carrying their unconscious mistress across battlefields and wilderness, through years of waiting at the Erdtree with no sign of Miquella's return. The description of Finley, the Cleanrot Knight who carried Malenia all the way back to the Erdtree after the Battle of Aeonia, speaks of this warrior single-handedly fending off enemies the entire journey. This level of dedication borders on the superhuman. While it could be explained by genuine loyalty and love for Malenia and her brother, we must at least consider whether Miquella's charm played a role in inspiring such absolute devotion. The Erdtree never reached its full potential. The description of various items tells us that the tree failed to grow into a true Erdtree. It became something significant, something beautiful and mighty, but it never fully matured into what Miquella envisioned. Perhaps this was because Miquella himself was cursed with eternal childhood and couldn't provide the full measure of what the tree needed. Perhaps it was because the greater will itself prevented any true rival to the Erdtree from emerging. Or perhaps it was because Miquella abandoned the project before it could be completed. Because that's exactly what happened. At some point, Miquella made a fateful decision. The Erdtree, for all its promise, was not enough. The needles of unalloyed gold could only delay his and Malenia's curses, not cure them. The eclipse he sought for Godwyn never came. His beautiful sanctuary, while providing hope for the downtrodden, didn't fundamentally change the nature of the lands between or break the greater will's dominance. Miquella needed more power. He needed to become not just an Empyrean, but a true god. And to do that, he would need to undertake a journey into the land of shadow itself, following in the footsteps of Queen Marika. But he couldn't simply walk that path. The route to the land of shadow was sealed, accessible only through specific means. Miquella would need help. Help from someone powerful enough to breach the boundary between worlds. And so, Miquella turned his attention to Mohg, Lord of Blood. What follows is one of the most disturbing revelations in all of Shadow of the Erdtree, the truth of what happened when Mohg took Miquella from the Erdtree. The Mohg Conspiracy. For the longest time, the community believed we understood Mohg's story. He was an omen twin, cast into the sewers of Leyndell alongside his brother, Morgott. While imprisoned in darkness, Mohg encountered the Formless Mother, an outer god of blood, who granted him terrible power. When the shattering occurred, Mohg claimed his great rune and established the Mohgwyn dynasty, a blood cult dedicated to his vision of a new age. And then, the story went, Mohg became obsessed with the Empyrean Miquella, seeking a path to become consort to a god and elevate his cursed dynasty to legitimacy, Mohg kidnapped the sleeping Miquella from his cocoon within the Halig tree. He brought the Empyrean to his palace beneath the earth and attempted to raise him to godhood through a blood ritual, sharing his own cursed blood with the young god-to-be. The description of Mohg's shackle seemed to confirm this narrative, speaking of Mohg's obsessive fixation. The remembrance of the Blood Lord describes Mohg's aspiration to become consort to a god and usher in his dynasty. Everything pointed to Mohg as the aggressor, Miquella as the victim, stolen away from his sanctuary and subjected to horrific blood rituals against his will. Shadow of the Erdtree completely upends this understanding. The truth, as revealed through various item descriptions and NPC dialogue in the expansion, is far more disturbing. Mohg wasn't the mastermind behind the kidnapping. He was the victim, charmed and manipulated by Miquella himself as part of a carefully orchestrated plan. The first hint of this comes from Sir Ansbach, one of the pureblood knights who served Mohg faithfully. When we encounter Ansbach in the Land of Shadow, he's one of the few NPCs not currently under Miquella's charm, having been freed when Miquella discarded his love. Ansbach speaks of his investigations into what truly happened between Mohg and Miquella and the disturbing conclusions he reached. According to Ansbach, Lord Mohg was himself manipulated by Miquella. The great and fearsome Omen Lord, powerful enough to establish his own dynasty and cult, was charmed by the Empyrean child and bent to serve Miquella's purposes. This means that everything that followed, the kidnapping, the blood rituals, even Mohg's obsessive fixation, were all results of Miquella's manipulation. The implications are staggering. Consider what we know of Mohg's character from the base game. He was violent, certainly, and his blood cult engaged in practices that were horrific by any standard. But Mohg was also intelligent and purposeful in his actions. He established an entire hidden dynasty, complete with devoted followers and a grand palace. He claimed a great rune and wielded it effectively. This was not a being easily controlled or manipulated through conventional means. Yet, Miquella's charm worked on him anyway. At some point, Miquella reached out to Mohg, either physically or through some other means, and ensnared the Lord of Blood in his compulsion. From that moment forward, Mohg's obsession with making Miquella his consort wasn't his own desire. It was Miquella's will imposed upon him. The description of the purifying crystal tear, which can negate Mohg's curse during his boss fight, takes on new meaning with this context. The curse Mohg inflicts, hemorrhage that counts down before dealing massive damage, might not have been originally meant for combat at all. Perhaps it was meant for the ritual he was attempting with Miquella, a ritual he performed not out of his own twisted desire, but because he was compelled to do so. But why would Miquella orchestrate his own kidnapping? The answer lies in where Miquella ended up, not just in Mohg Palace, but in the Land of Shadow beyond. The Land of Shadow, as revealed in the expansion, is the place where Queen Marika began her path to godhood. It's separated from the lands between, sealed away by Marika herself after she ascended. To reach it normally would be impossible. However, there was another way. Miquella could follow the path his mother took, undergoing a journey of transformation that would strip away everything that limited him and allow him to ascend to true godhood. But he needed to physically reach the Land of Shadow first, and Mohg Palace, as it turns out, sits at a threshold. The description of Mohg's Great Rune mentions that his palace exists in a place between worlds, between the surface lands and something deeper. This is where Mohg's usefulness to Miquella's plan becomes clear. By having Mohg kidnap him and bring him to this threshold location, Miquella positioned himself to enter the Land of Shadow. But there's another, even more disturbing element to this plan. Mohg's body itself was necessary for what came next. In the final boss fight of Shadow of the Erdtree, we don't face Miquella alone. Instead, we battle promised consort Radahn. But this Radahn is inhabiting Mohg's body. The corpse cocoon we find in Mohg Palace, which we assumed was Miquella, trapped in some ritual, was actually Miquella's own abandoned body. The young Empyrean had already departed, leaving his cursed childlike form behind. But he left it in Mohg's care for a reason. That body, combined with Mohg's own corpse after we defeat him, would serve as the vessel for Radahn's resurrection. Miquella needed Mohg, not just to reach the Land of Shadow, but to provide the physical form his promised consort would need. The entire kidnapping, the years of blood rituals, all of it was in preparation for turning Mohg's body into a suitable vessel. Consider what this means for Mohg himself. He spent years performing these rituals, believing in his heart that he was working towards his own dynasty, that he would be consort to a god and finally achieve the recognition and power that was denied to him as an omen. Every drop of blood he shared, every prayer to the formless mother, every moment spent in that cocoon chamber, all of it was done in service of a goal that was never truly his own. And then we, the Tarnished, kill him. We fight our way into Mohg Palace. We battle the Lord of Blood and we strike him down. From Mohg's perspective, assuming any part of his true consciousness remained beneath Miquella's charm, he died never understanding that his grand ambition was implanted by another. He never knew that his obsession with Miquella was artificial, that his great dynasty was just a means to someone else's end. Sir Ansbach understood this, and it tormented him. As one of Mohg's loyal knights, Ansbach served his lord faithfully. When he pieced together what had actually happened, the horror of it drove him to follow into the Land of Shadow, seeking to either save Mohg or at least avenge him by stopping Miquella's plan. The dialogue Ansbach provides paints a picture of a knight wrestling with conflicting loyalties, devotion to his lord, admiration for what Miquella claimed to represent. and horror at the manipulation he discovered. The other pureblood knights never got the chance to understand. Most remained loyal to Mohg's vision even after his death, still believing in the Mohgwyn dynasty. They continued to defend the palace, continued to practice their blood rituals, unaware that their entire cause was built on a lie, and that their lord was a puppet dancing on strings they couldn't see. But there's another layer to this that makes it even more disturbing. When did Miquella charm Mohg? Was it during the shattering, when both were claiming their great runes? Earlier, when both were young? Or was it a long-term plan, with Miquella establishing control over Mohg gradually over many years? The timeline isn't entirely clear, but we can make some educated guesses. Miquella's cocoon within the Erdtree suggests he was attempting some kind of transformation or awakening there first. The cocoon is described as being made of crystalline material, and Miquella was in a deep sleep within it. This matches what we see in Mohgwyn Palace, another cocoon, but this one clearly disturbed and empty. It's possible that Miquella began his transformation within the Erdtree, but realized he needed to take a different path. He couldn't ascend to godhood through the Erdtree alone. It wasn't a true Erdtree, and his curse of eternal childhood might have prevented him from ever completing such a transformation there. So, he pivoted to a new plan. Enter the land of shadow and follow Marika's path directly. To do this, he needed to get to a threshold location, and he needed a vessel for what would come after. Mohg provided both, so Miquella reached out with his charm, ensnared the Lord of Blood, and orchestrated the entire kidnapping scenario. He allowed himself to be taken, knowing that Mohg would bring him to precisely where he needed to be. The blood rituals Mohg performed might have even served a secondary purpose. The Formless Mother's blood magic, while horrific, was powerful. If Miquella could harness or redirect that power, it might aid his transformation, or in preparing Mohg's body for its eventual use. We know that Miquella walked the path to godhood by shedding parts of himself, his flesh, his doubts, his fears. Perhaps the blood rituals helped facilitate that shedding, burning away parts of his being that held him back. One question remains. Did Mohg ever break free from the charm, even briefly? Did he have any moments of clarity where he realized what was being done to him? The description of Mohg's spear, which can be crafted from his remembrance, speaks of his devotion to the Formless Mother and his vision for the dynasty. There's no hint of doubt or confusion there, but the remembrance itself mentions that Mohg harbored ambitions toward a different future, one dyed in blood. It's possible that Miquella's charm was so complete that Mohg never suspected anything was wrong. To the very end, he might have believed his obsession with Miquella was his own desire, that his plan to become consort was his own ambition. If so, that might actually be a mercy. The alternative, that Mohg had moments where the charm wavered and he realized he was trapped, unable to resist the compulsion, driving him forward toward his own doom. It's almost too cruel to contemplate. Sir Ansbach's final dialogue in the Land of Shadow provides perhaps the most poignant epitaph for Mohg. He speaks of his lord not as a monster or villain, but as someone worthy of dignity and respect, someone whose memory deserved to be honored, and he vows to stop Miquella, not out of hatred, but to protect what remained of Mohg's legacy from being completely subsumed into someone else's story. The Mohg conspiracy reveals the darkest aspect of Miquella's methods. Here was a demigod who spoke of compassion and kindness, yet who was willing to completely override another being's free will for years, turning them into an unwitting tool for his own ascension. If Miquella could do this to someone as powerful as Mohg, if he could maintain such complete control for so long, what else was he capable of? And more importantly, what would his age of compassion actually look like if this was how he treated even those who served his purposes? Saint Trina and the Discarded Love. To understand the full tragedy of Miquella's transformation, we must examine what he left behind in the Land of Shadow. Among the various parts of himself that Miquella shed on his path to divinity, none is more significant or more disturbing than his abandonment of Saint Trina, the personification of his love and compassion. For the longest time, Saint Trina was one of Elden Ring's most intriguing mysteries. Throughout the base game, we find references to this figure, a deity associated with sleep, peace, and purple lilies. Saint Trina's torch, Saint Trina's lily, and various sleep-inducing items and incantations all referenced this enigmatic saint. The description of Saint Trina's torch tells us that it is said that Saint Trina is the most fearsome Empyrean of all. But wait, the most fearsome Empyrean? That exact same phrase was used to describe Miquella. This wasn't coincidence. It was a hint at the truth. Saint Trina and Miquella were one and the same being, or more accurately, two aspects of the same being, much like how Marika and Radahn existed as separate entities within a single divine form. Saint Trina was Miquella's love, given form. The description of Saint Trina's lily states that sleep is the greatest of mercies, a blanket that shrouds the pain of existence. This philosophy of compassionate escape, of offering respite from suffering through gentle sleep, represented one side of Miquella's nature, the part that truly did care about alleviating pain, that wanted to ease the suffering of those around him. The cult that grew around Saint Trina worshipped this aspect specifically. The Saint Trina's lily item description references priests who devoted themselves to spreading sleep and peace. The Saint Trina's arrow recipe tells us that these arrows were crafted to help those unable to sleep find rest. Those weren't tools of manipulation or control in the way that Miquella's charm was. They were offerings of genuine comfort, allowing the tormented to escape their pain temporarily. But there was always a duality to this relationship. The sleep Saint Trina offered wasn't always voluntary. The various sleep-inducing weapons and incantations could be used against enemies, forcing them into unconsciousness. This was still a form of removing agency, even if it was gentler than outright charm or control. And yet, there seemed to be a genuine benevolence to St. Trina's nature that tempered or balanced Miquella's more manipulative tendencies. The shadow of the Erdtree expansion reveals what happened to St. Trina, and it's heartbreaking. Deep within the stone coffin fissure, a dark and forgotten place in the land of shadow, we find the remains of St. Trina. She has been discarded, abandoned by Miquella, as he shed his love on the path to godhood. What we find isn't a corpse, but rather a vast field of purple lilies growing around a massive, dissolving manifestation of divine essence. When we approach this site, we can actually speak with St. Trina, or what remains of her. If we consume enough of her essence through the lilies scattered throughout the area, St. Trina communicates with us, and what she says recontextualizes Miquella's entire plan. She begs us to stop Miquella. She pleads with us to kill him, to grant him the death he needs. The specific dialogue is crucial. St. Trina tells us that godhood would be a prison for Miquella, that it would cage him and bind him far more completely than his curse ever did. She speaks not with anger or resentment at being abandoned, but with love and concern for what Miquella is becoming. Even discarded, even dying, St. Trina's primary concern is for Miquella himself, not her own fate. This revelation reframes everything we thought we understood about Miquella's plan. St. Trina, who is Miquella's love and compassion, opposes his ascension. The part of him that genuinely cared about others, that wanted to ease suffering and bring peace, recognized that godhood wasn't the answer. More than that, it recognized that what Miquella was becoming through this process of shedding wasn't better than what he was. It was worse. Think about what this means. Miquella's plan required him to discard his ability to love. The age of compassion he sought to create would be imposed by a god who had literally cut away his own compassion to achieve power. How could such an age truly be one of kindness or care when its architect had deliberately excised those very qualities from his being? The items we find around St. Trina's remains tell more of this story. The nectar of the Empyrean item, which can be collected from the lilies, describes it as the final essence of St. Trina, full of love for both herself and for those who've suffered. The description notes that this nectar can be mixed to create powerful sleep-inducing concoctions, but it can also be offered to someone specific in the land of shadow. Tialie, a devotee of St. Trina, who followed her into the shadowed realm. Tialie's questline provides additional context on St. Trina's nature and her relationship with Miquella. Tialie is completely devoted to St. Trina, worshipping her as the saint of sleep and mercy. When he learns that St. Trina and Miquella are the same being, he's devastated. When he discovers that Miquella has abandoned Saint Trina. His faith is shaken to its core. And when Saint Trina herself tells him that Miquella must die, Tialier is forced to choose between his devotion to the saint and his instinctive reverence for the Empyrean she once was part of. The fact that Saint Trina asks to have Miquella killed is particularly significant. In the lands between, death is complicated. With the rune of death sealed away, true death is rare. But Saint Trina isn't asking for Miquella to simply be defeated or dethroned. She's asking for him to be granted a true death, a permanent end. She believes this would be a mercy, a release from what he's becoming. This raises a profound question. If Miquella's own love believes his godhood would be a prison worse than death, what does that say about the age of compassion he sought to create? Was his entire plan fundamentally flawed from the beginning? Or did the plan become corrupted when he decided that achieving godhood required discarding the very compassion he claimed to champion? We can trace the moment of this betrayal through the crosses Miquella left behind in the Land of Shadow. These crosses mark places where Miquella shed different aspects of himself, and each one provides a memory or vision of what was discarded. One of these crosses specifically marks where Miquella abandoned his love. At this location, we can trigger a memory showing the moment of abandonment. The vision is brief but powerful. We see Miquella consciously choosing to shed this aspect of himself, knowing full well what it meant. This wasn't an accident or an unavoidable consequence of his transformation. It was a deliberate choice, and this choice had immediate consequences for his followers. When Miquella discarded his love, the charm that held many of his followers broke. Sir Ansbach, as we've discussed, found himself suddenly free and able to see clearly what had been done to Mohg. But others reacted differently. Needle Knight Leda, perhaps Miquella's most devoted follower, didn't break free from her loyalty. Instead, she doubled down, becoming paranoid and violent toward anyone who might threaten Miquella's ascension. The various dialogue options with Leda throughout the shadow of the Erdtree expansion show her psychological deterioration. Early on, she speaks of Miquella with reverence and certainty. As his journey progresses and he sheds more of himself, Leda becomes increasingly erratic. She begins to see enemies everywhere, to suspect even longtime allies of betrayal. By the end, she's willing to kill anyone who hesitates or questions the path, viewing any doubt as treachery. This degradation mirrors what happened to Miquella himself, as he shed his love, his fear, his doubts, all the human elements that made him truly compassionate. What remained was pure will and ambition. Leda, still under his charm, but no longer balanced by his love's influence, reflected this change. She became the sword that cut down anyone in Miquella's path, without mercy or hesitation. The contrast between Saint Trina and what Miquella became is stark. Saint Trina offered escape and comfort. asking nothing in return. She granted sleep to ease suffering, and those who worshipped her did so freely, drawn by genuine gratitude for the mercy she provided. Miquella, stripped of his love, offered only compulsion and control. His age of compassion would not be chosen by its subjects, it would be forced upon them. Their affection for their god, mandated by his charm, rather than earned through genuine benevolence. There's a terrible irony to this. Miquella sought to free himself and others from curses, to break the cycles of suffering perpetuated by the Golden Order. But in pursuing godhood, he became something worse than what he opposed. The Golden Order, at least, had the honesty of force. It imposed its will openly, never pretending that obedience was anything other than submission to power. Miquella's planned age would be more insidious, a world where everyone loved their god and obeyed his will, never realizing they had no choice in the matter. Saint Trina understood this. That's why she begged for Miquella's death. It wasn't revenge for being abandoned. It was a desperate, final act of love. If Miquella couldn't be saved from his path, couldn't be turned back from his goal, then the most compassionate thing would be to end his journey before he achieved godhood and imposed his warped vision on all the lands between. The location where we find Saint Trina is also symbolically significant. The stone coffin fissure is a dark, forgotten place, deep beneath the surface, filled with the stone coffins that give it its name. These coffins suggest burial, death, and endings. Saint Trina isn't just abandoned here, she's been deliberately buried, entombed in this dark place, so that Miquella wouldn't have to face what he'd discarded. The purple lilies that cover the area, growing from Saint Trina's dissolving essence, represent a final gift to the world. Even dying, even abandoned, this aspect of Miquella still tries to offer comfort and peace. The lilies can be used to craft sleep arrows, grease, and other items that help ease suffering or provide escape. Saint Trina's final act is one of genuine compassion, giving what remains of herself to help others. Compare this to Miquella's actions on his path to godhood. He used Mohg as an unwitting tool, manipulated countless followers, discarded those he loved, and pursued power at any cost. Saint Trina gave herself away freely to ease others' pain. The difference could not be more clear, and it raises the question, which one truly embodied the ideals of compassion and kindness that Miquella claimed to champion? Some might argue that Miquella had to discard his love to achieve the power necessary to create his age of compassion, that the ends, a world free from the Golden Order's cruelty, justified the means of temporarily setting aside his compassionate nature. But Saint Trina's final message demolishes this rationalization. She, who is that love and compassion, recognizes that godhood achieved through such sacrifice becomes corrupt. A god without love cannot create an age of compassion. no matter how much power they wield. The tragic element is that there might have been another path. If Miquella had accepted his limitations, accepted that he couldn't become a god, he could have still made a difference. The Erdtree, for all its flaws, provided genuine sanctuary to thousands of persecuted souls. His unalloyed gold, while not a complete cure, helped Melania maintain herself despite her rot. His prayers and efforts for Godwin, while unsuccessful, showed real care and devotion. Miquella, as an Empyrean, cursed but caring, achieved real good in the world. Miquella, as a god, loveless and controlling, would have been a nightmare dressed up as paradise. Saint Trina knew this, and so she asked us, the Tarnished, to stop him, to grant him the mercy of death before he could cage himself and everyone else in his broken vision of compassion. In the end, Saint Trina's abandonment represents the death of everything good in Miquella's plan. The moment he discarded his love was the moment his age of compassion became a lie. What followed was simply a quest for power, dressed up in the language of mercy, but stripped of any genuine care for those it claimed to love. The Promise to Radahn. Among all the revelations in Shadow of the Erdtree, perhaps none shocked the community more than the truth about Radahn's role in Miquella's plan. The final boss of the expansion isn't Miquella alone. Its promised consort Radahn, the legendary Star-Scourge general, resurrected in Mohg's body to serve as Miquella's Lord Consort. But the story of how this came to be reaches far back into the past, to a promise made when both were young. The remembrance of a god and a lord, obtained after defeating this final boss, provides the crucial detail. It states that Miquella made a vow with Radahn, a promise that the general would serve as his consort when Miquella ascended to godhood. This wasn't a recent arrangement or a desperate last-minute plan. This was something agreed upon long ago, before the Shattering, before the wars that tore the lands between apart. But understanding this vow requires us to examine who Radahn was and what he represented. Star-Scourge Radahn was born of Radahn and Rennala, making him Miquella's half-brother through their shared father. From his youngest days, Radahn idolized Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, seeking to emulate the mighty warrior in every way. He modeled his armor after Godfrey's adopted similar fighting techniques, and even took on his own beast companion in the form of his scrawny horse, Leonard, much as Godfrey had the same beast regent Sarosh upon his back. Radahn grew to become one of the mightiest warriors in the lands between. His mastery of gravitational magic, learned in the town of Celia, allowed him to manipulate the forces of nature itself. The description of Radahn's various spells and items tells us that he learned gravity magic, specifically so he could continue riding Leonard despite growing to enormous size. But his power grew far beyond this practical application. Radahn's greatest feat was halting the stars themselves. The description of Radahn's great rune and various related items tells us that he challenged the very stars and won, holding them in stasis through sheer force of gravitational magic. This wasn't merely symbolic. The stars in Elden Ring's cosmos are tied to fate itself. By halting them, Radahn literally froze the destinies of those whose fates were tied to the stars' movements. This included Ranni, whose path to her age of stars required the stars to move once more. This was a warrior of incredible pride, power, and martial prowess, someone who defined himself through strength and conquest, who sought glory on the battlefield, who stood as one of the mightiest demigods in an era of godlike beings. Why would such a figure agree to serve as consort to Miquella, to submit to another's godhood, rather than pursue his own claim to power? The answer lies in the nature of the vow itself and when it was made. The remembrance description indicates this was a promise from their youth, likely before either fully understood what it would mean. We know that Miquella possessed his charm, even as a child. His ability to compel affection wasn't something he learned, but something innate to his nature as an Empyrean. It's entirely possible that when young Radahn made this vow, he did so under the influence of Miquella's charm, his genuine feelings of brotherhood and respect, amplified into a binding promise he would later regret. But there's another possibility that the game hints at. Perhaps Radahn genuinely believed in Miquella's vision, at least initially. The young Empyrean spoke of creating a world free from the Golden Order's cruelty, a world where the strong protected the weak rather than exploiting them. For someone like Radahn, who idolized Godfrey's warrior nobility, such a vision might have held genuine appeal. A vow made in good faith between brothers who shared a dream of a better world. What we know for certain is that at some point, something changed. Radahn didn't wait patiently for Miquella's ascension. Instead, he claimed his own great rune during the Shattering and defended Caelid as his territory. He made no moves toward helping Miquella achieve godhood. He continued his war against the stars, maintaining the stasis that prevented multiple fates from unfolding, including, potentially, whatever role he was supposed to play in Miquella's plan. This brings us to one of the most controversial theories that Shadow of the Erdtree all but confirms. Malenia's expedition to Caelid and her battle with Radahn wasn't random warfare or sibling rivalry. It was orchestrated by Miquella to deliver a specific message to his promised consort. The evidence for this is found in Freya's dialogue in the expansion. Freya, one of Radahn's soldiers and champions, recounts what she witnessed during the Battle of Aeonia. She describes Malenia approaching Radahn's forces, specifically seeking out the general himself, and when the two mighty demigods finally met in combat, Freya witnessed Malenia whisper something to Radahn before their battle began. What did Melania whisper? Freya doesn't tell us the exact words, but the implication is clear. Melania was delivering a message from Miquella, a reminder of the vow Radahn had made, a call to fulfill his promise. And Radahn, rather than accept this call, chose to fight. He chose to face Melania, one of the only warriors who could match him in combat, rather than submit to Miquella's plan. The Battle of Aeonia was catastrophic. Melania had never known defeat, and Radahn was mighty enough to hold the stars themselves at bay. When these two forces collided, the results were apocalyptic. The battle raged with neither side gaining clear advantage, until Melania made the fateful decision to unleash the scarlet rot she had fought so hard to contain. The description of the Scarlet Aeonia incantation tells us about this moment. Melania allowed the flower of rot to bloom, releasing a plague that consumed everything around her. Radahn and his forces were infected. The land of Caelid was transformed into a rotting hellscape, and Melania herself fell into a deep coma from the exertion. The clean-wrought knight Finlay carried her unconscious mistress all the way back to the Erdtree, a journey that must have taken considerable time and effort. But here's the crucial detail. The battle had no victor. Melania did not defeat Radahn, despite blooming the scarlet rot. Radahn didn't defeat Melania, despite his might and gravitational powers. The battle ended in a draw that destroyed both combatants and devastated the surrounding lands. This outcome raises important questions about Melania's true objective. If Melania's goal was to kill Radahn outright, she failed. But what if that was never the objective? What if the point wasn't to defeat Radahn in the traditional sense, but to prepare him for what came next? The scarlet rot that infected Radahn didn't kill him immediately. Instead, it drove him mad, reducing him to a bestial state where he wandered the dunes of Caelid in agony, slowly being consumed by the disease, while his great rune burned away in resistance. From Miquella's perspective, this might have been exactly what was needed. Radahn in his prime would never willingly submit to being a consort. His pride, his power, his commitment to his own path would prevent him from honoring a vow made in youth. But Radahn reduced to a mad, suffering beast, Radahn killed by the Tarnished, and his soul freed from his rotting body, that Radahn could be reshaped, remade, resurrected into a new form that would serve Miquella's purposes. The description of various items related to Radahn's fate supports this theory. General Radahn's great rune states that it was the most sacred of all great runes, continually burning to resist the scarlet rot's encroachment. This wasn't just infection. It was a slow, agonizing decay that Radahn fought against every moment until we finally granted him death in combat. When we defeat Starscourge Radahn in the base game, we're not just ending a boss fight, we're freeing his soul from a rotted prison, and this freed soul becomes available for Miquella's plans, using Mohg's body as a vessel, using whatever necromantic or divine powers he'd accumulated on his path through the Land of Shadow. Miquella resurrects Radahn as his consort. But this resurrected Radahn is different from the warrior we fought in Caelid. Promised consort Radahn wields two great swords instead of his iconic colossal weapons. His fighting style is faster, more aggressive, augmented with Miquella's own light-based attacks. And most tellingly, he shows no sign of independent will or personality. He doesn't speak, doesn't display the warrior's pride that defined the original Radahn. He is purely a weapon, a tool for Miquella to wield in the final battle. Did Radahn consent to this resurrection? The game provides no evidence that he did. Jaren, Radahn's loyal retainer, organized the Festival of Combat specifically to grant his general an honorable death and release from the Rot's torment. The description of Jaren's questline makes it clear that this was done out of mercy and respect, giving Radahn the warrior's death he deserved. The idea that Radahn would then want to be resurrected in someone else's body to serve as another's consort contradicts everything we know about his character. Sir Ansbach's dialogue reinforces this interpretation. When he discovers what Miquella has done, he's appalled. He speaks of Miquella desecrating Mohg's body, but the horror extends to what was done to Radahn as well. Two mighty demigods, both with their own wills and ambitions, reduced to components in Miquella's scheme. Mohg's body used as a vessel, Radahn's soul used as a weapon. The vow that Miquella made with Radahn becomes, in this light, not an agreement between equals, but a binding chain. Whether Radahn made the promise willingly under the influence of Miquella's charm, or made it genuinely but later changed his mind, the result is the same. Miquella held Radahn to that vow regardless of the general's own wishes, using Melania to incapacitate him and then resurrecting him in a form that he couldn't refuse. This raises profound moral questions about consent, coercion, and the nature of promises. Even if we grant that Radahn did make the vow willingly in his youth, do childhood promises bind us forever? If Radahn had clearly rejected the path by claiming his own great rune and defending his own territory, didn't he have the right to change his mind? And even if he was obligated to honor his word, did that obligation extend beyond death, giving Miquella the right to resurrect and reshape him? From Miquella's perspective, perhaps the answer to all these questions was yes. If Radahn had promised to be his consort, then that promise was binding, regardless of subsequent actions. If the lands between needed Miquella to become a god to escape the Golden Order's tyranny, then personal desires, even his own, even Radahn's, were secondary to that greater goal. The end justified the means, even when those means included forcing a resurrection upon someone who had already found peace in death. But this reasoning exposes the fundamental corruption at the heart of Miquella's plan. He began with ideals of compassion, of protecting the weak and freeing the world from tyranny. Yet, in pursuing those ideals, he committed acts that were themselves tyrannical. He overrode free will, manipulated emotions, and forced others into servitude. The age of compassion he sought to create would be built on a foundation of compulsion and control. Radahn's fate also highlights the tragedy of the Shattering's aftermath. Here was a warrior who sought glory and strength, who wanted to be like the heroes of old, who held back the very stars through force of will, and in the end, he was reduced twice, first to a mindless beast consumed by rot, then to a resurrected puppet dancing on strings he couldn't even perceive. The proud, star-scourged general became promised consort Radahn, a title that represented not honor or choice, but subjugation. The final boss fight itself drives this home. When we face promised consort Radahn, Miquella rides upon his shoulders, directing the battle. The symbolism is clear. Radahn is now merely a mount, a weapon, a tool for Miquella's use. All the general's might, all his legendary prowess, now serves another's will entirely. And when we finally defeat this twisted pairing, we're not just stopping Miquella's ascension, we're freeing Radahn a second time, granting him the permanent death he should have received in Caelid. The other demigods' reactions to this plan, had they known of it, would likely have been horror. Even those who committed terrible acts in their own right maintained some sense of autonomy and respect for others' will. Rykard sought to devour the world, but those who joined him at the Volcano Manor did so by choice. Ranni orchestrated the Night of Black Knives, but her followers served her willingly, and she sought to remove the god's influence entirely rather than impose her own. Even Mohg, for all his blood cult's atrocities, gathered followers who genuinely chose to serve his vision. Only Miquella, the kindest of all demigods, the one who spoke most of compassion and care, built his entire plan on removing choice from those around him. The promise to Radahn was just one example of this pattern, but it was perhaps the most damning. It showed that Miquella's ambitions extended beyond charming followers or manipulating circumstances. He was willing to reach beyond death itself to claim what he believed was owed to him. Journey through Shadow. To reach the point where he could resurrect Radahn and achieve godhood, Miquella had to undertake a journey through the land of Shadow itself. This realm, sealed away by Queen Marika after her own ascension, served as both a literal path and a metaphorical one, a place where Miquella would shed everything that made him who he was in pursuit of divinity. The Land of Shadow is revealed in the expansion to be the place where Marika began her path to godhood. It's a realm of contradictions, beautiful yet decaying, holding both ancient wonders and recent horrors. The description of various items found throughout the region tell us that this was once where Marika's people, the Newmen, lived before she sealed it away. The inhabitants who remained were trapped in a land separated from the Erdtree's grace, left to deal with the consequences of their goddess abandoning them. Miquella's crosses mark his path through this realm. These golden crosses are found at specific locations throughout the Land of Shadow, and each one represents a place where Miquella deliberately shed an aspect of himself. The description of the crosses tells us they were left behind as Miquella divested himself of his flesh, his strength, his lineage, his doubts, and most significantly, his love. The first cross marks where Miquella shed his flesh. This is the most literal of the transformations. Miquella abandoned his cursed physical body, the child's form that had imprisoned him since birth. The nascent butterfly's association with Miquella and transformation takes on new meaning here. Just as these butterflies are drawn to discarded godly skin, Miquella had to literally shed his skin to continue his journey. This explains the empty cocoon in Mohg Palace. This wasn't Miquella trapped by Mohg's ritual. It was Miquella's discarded body, left behind after he had no more use for it. The physical form that had once limited him, that had marked him as eternally young and incomplete, was cast off like an old garment. But in shedding his flesh, Miquella also shed the physical limitations that might have restrained his more extreme impulses. The next cross marks where Miquella abandoned his great rune. This is particularly significant because the great runes were fragments of the Elden Ring itself, sources of tremendous power that all the demigods fought to claim and maintain. Miquella's great rune would have granted him authority and might, yet he chose to discard it. The description of this cross suggests that Miquella recognized the great runes as chains binding him to the Grand Order, tools of the greater will's power structure. To truly transcend the existing system, he had to reject even this source of power. Another cross represents where Miquella shed his doubt and hesitation. This is perhaps the most psychologically revealing abandonment. Doubt is what keeps ambition in check, what causes us to question whether our goals justify our methods. By deliberately discarding his doubts, Miquella ensured he wouldn't falter or reconsider his path, no matter what it required. He made himself unable to question whether forcing Radahn's resurrection was wrong, unable to wonder if using Mohg was cruel, unable to hesitate before discarding Saint Trina. The cross marking where Miquella abandoned his fears speaks to similar psychological transformation. Fear serves as a warning system, alerting us to danger and causing us to approach situations with appropriate caution. Without fear, Miquella could pursue any goal, regardless of risk or consequence. Combined with the loss of doubt, this made him unstoppable in his drive toward godhood, but it also made him incapable of recognizing when he should stop. But the most significant cross, as we've discussed, is where Miquella abandoned his love. Saint Trina, the personification of his compassion and care, was deliberately discarded at the stone coffin fissure. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the transformation process. It was a conscious choice. Miquella decided that love was something he needed to shed to achieve godhood. The memory sequences we can witness at each cross provide glimpses of these moments of abandonment. We see Miquella making these choices deliberately, with full awareness of what he was giving up. These aren't sacrifices forced upon him by the path. They're acts of will, conscious decisions to strip away everything that might hold him back from his goal. As Miquella progressed through the land of shadow, his followers accompanied him, at least initially. Needle Knight Leda, his most devoted warrior, led a group that included various characters we encounter throughout the expansion. But as Miquella shed more of himself, the dynamics among his followers changed dramatically. When Miquella discarded his love, the charm that held many of his followers broke or weakened. Sir Ansbach found himself suddenly able to think clearly and see what had actually been done to Mohg. He turned against Miquella's plan, determined to stop the Empyrean from achieving godhood. Others in the group experienced a similar awakening, though their reactions varied. Hornsent, a warrior seeking revenge for the massacre of his people, had followed Miquella, hoping for justice or perhaps the power to claim it himself. When freed from the charm's influence, he recognized that Miquella's age of compassion would never deliver the vengeance he sought. The gentle sleep of Miquella's ideal world had no place for wrath or retribution, even against those who had committed genocide. Talia, devoted to Saint Trina above all else, was devastated to learn that Miquella and Saint Trina were the same being, and then horrified to discover that Miquella had abandoned his other self. His faith in Miquella shattered completely when Saint Trina herself told him that Miquella needed to die. Talia's entire worldview collapsed, rebuilt, and collapsed again in rapid succession. Only Needle Knight Leda remained completely devoted, and even her devotion took a dark turn. Freed from the moderating influence of Miquella's love, but still bound to serve him, Leda became paranoid and violent. She began to see threats everywhere, suspecting even longtime allies of potential betrayal. Her dialogue throughout the expansion shows a progression from confident devotion to frantic zealotry, willing to kill anyone who might interfere with Miquella's ascension. The Land of Shadow itself seemed to reflect Miquella's transformation. As we explore the region, we find evidence of both Miquella's stated ideals and the dark reality of his methods. The churches scattered throughout the land show that Miquella's message of compassion had spread here, gathering followers who genuinely believed in his vision. But we also find the tools of compulsion, bewitching branches, sleep-inducing items, and evidence of Miquella's charm at work. One location that stands out is the Shaman village, revealed to be where Marika herself came from. The description of items found here tells us about the village's tragic history. Its inhabitants possessed special qualities that made them targets for exploitation, they could meld with other beings, a trait that led to them being grafted and used by others. Marika emerged from this violated people, and her path to godhood began with escaping the fate of her kin. Miquella's visit to the shaman village and his journey mirroring Marika's path suggests he understood something crucial. Becoming a god required not just power, but a willingness to sacrifice everything else. Marika had sealed away her homeland and its memories to achieve godhood. Miquella would do the same, sealing away his love, his doubts, his very humanity in pursuit of divine ascension. The progression made of Miquella's crosses traces a path of deliberate self-destruction. Not physical destruction, but the destruction of everything that made Miquella who he was as a person. His flesh gone, his great rune abandoned, his doubt discarded, his fear shed, his love cast away. What remained was pure will and ambition, a being focused entirely on achieving godhood, with no consideration for cost or consequence. This journey through shadow parallels other transformations we see in Elden Ring. Ranni killed her own flesh to escape the Two Fingers' control, but she maintained her will and goals throughout. Rykard was devoured by the god-devouring serpent, but did so believing his consciousness would persist and guide the serpent's eternal growth. Mohg was transformed by the formless mother's power, but remained himself throughout, his goals and personality intact. Only Miquella engaged in such systematic self-annihilation, and the tragic irony is that he did it all in service of creating an age of compassion, using methods that demonstrated he no longer understood what compassion truly meant. Each cross marks not just something abandoned, but something betrayed. His flesh represented his curse, yes, but also his connection to morality and limitation. His great rune was a chain, but a responsibility to those who looked up to him for leadership. His doubt and fear were restraints, but also safeguards against excess. And his love, Saint Trina, represented not weakness to be overcome, but the very thing that made his vision worthwhile. Without love, the age of compassion became a contradiction in terms. It would be an age of enforced contentment, of mandated affection, of peace without choice. The crosses mark the path where Miquella's noble dream corrupted into tyrannical ambition. By the time Miquella reached the gate of divinity, the point where he would attempt his final ascension, he had become something far removed from the kind Empyrean who once watered the Erdtree with his blood. He was a being of pure purpose, stripped of everything that might cause him to question or hesitate, and waiting for him was Radahn, resurrected in Mohg's body, ready to serve as the consort who would complete Miquella's apotheosis. The Age of Compassion Deconstructed. Throughout Miquella's story, we hear repeatedly about his vision for the age of compassion, a new era that would replace the Golden Order's harsh hierarchies with gentleness and care. But what would this age have actually looked like if Miquella had succeeded? And more importantly, would it truly have been compassionate, or merely another form of tyranny, dressed in a kinder language? The description of various items and dialogue from Miquella's followers give us glimpses of what this age was meant to entail. The age of compassion would ostensibly be a time when all beings, regardless of their nature or origin, would be accepted and embraced. There would be no persecution of omen, no slavery of misbegotten, no hunting of albinarics. All would live in peace under Miquella's benevolent guidance. The Erdtree served as a prototype for this vision. There, the outcasts of the lands between found sanctuary. Different species and peoples who had warred or avoided each other for centuries lived side by side. The clean-wrought knights, human warriors, fought alongside Erdtree knights while protecting albinaric refugees. This integration and acceptance represented what Miquella hoped to extend to all the lands between. But the mechanism by which this peace would be maintained raises crucial questions. Miquella's charm ensured devotion and affection from those around him. In his age of compassion, would this charm extend to all people? Would everyone in the lands between find themselves compelled to love their God and each other, their conflicts dissolved not through understanding or choice, but supernatural compulsion? The bewitching branch and its ability to turn enemies into allies provides a model for how this might work. The description notes that sharing these branches was a ritual of trust, but anyone who's used them knows the truth. The charmed enemy has no choice. Their aggression is overridden, their hostility replaced with compelled affection. If this was the basis for Miquella's age, then the peace it provided would be artificial, a suppression of genuine conflicts and differences rather than their resolution. There's also the question of what happens to those aspects of life and emotion that don't fit neatly into compassion. Anger at injustice, righteous fury against oppression, the drive for personal ambition or achievement. Would these all be smothered away by Miquella's charm? Hornsent's questline explores this directly. He followed Miquella initially, drawn by the promise of a better world. But once freed from the charm, he recognized that Miquella's compassion had no room for his need for justice or vengeance against those who had massacred his people. The age of compassion, as Miquella conceived it, would be one of enforced harmony. Everyone would love everyone else because they were compelled to do so. Conflicts would cease not because people learned to understand each other or address legitimate grievances, but because the capacity for conflict itself was suppressed. It would be a world of mandated happiness, required kindness, obligatory affection. St. Trina's final message illuminates why this would be a prison rather than a paradise. She describes godhood itself as a cage for Miquella, something that would bind and limit him far more than his curse ever did. But her concern extends beyond just Miquella. She sees that his planned age would cage everyone. A world where love is compelled is a world where genuine love becomes impossible. A peace maintained through charm is not true peace at all, but simply the absence of visible conflict. Compare this to the other possible endings of Elden Ring. The default ending sees the Tarnished become Elden Lord and restore the Golden Order, perpetuating its hierarchies, but also its stability. It's honest in what it offers: order through power, clearly defined rules and consequences. The Age of Stars ending with Ranni removes the god's influence entirely, leaving people free to make their own choices and mistakes without divine interference. The Frenzied Flame ending destroys everything, a nihilistic rejection of the entire system. Each of these endings has clear costs and benefits. The restored Golden Order maintains its injustices. The Age of Stars removes guidance and protection, along with control. The Frenzied Flame obliterates all possibility of future good, along with current suffering. But they're all honest about what they are. Only Miquella's Age of Compassion promises kindness while delivering control, speaks of freedom while binding everyone more completely than the Golden Order ever did. The dialogue and descriptions we encounter suggest that some of Miquella's followers understood this, at least partially. The various NPCs we meet who serve Miquella often speak in terms that hint at uncomfortable truths beneath the surface. They describe his power, his wisdom, his fearsome nature, but rarely his actual compassion and practice. They speak of being drawn to him, compelled to serve, unable to resist. Language that suggests compulsion rather than choice. Even Malenia, Miquella's twin sister and most devoted protector, speaks of him in terms that raise questions. She tells us that Miquella is the most fearsome Empyrean of all, that he possesses wisdom and allure, but she never claims he's the most compassionate or kind. Those are reputations others apply to him, not qualities his closest family member emphasizes. Malenia's absolute devotion to her brother is genuine, rooted in their shared suffering and his efforts to help her. But even she describes his power to inspire loyalty in terms that sound more like domination than inspiration. The fact that Miquella had to discard his love to achieve godhood fundamentally undermines the entire premise of an age of compassion. How can a being without the capacity for love create an age defined by compassionate care? The answer is that it can't, at least not genuine compassion. What Miquella would have created was a simulacrum of compassion, enforced through divine power and charm. There's evidence throughout the expansion that Miquella's methods increasingly contradicted his stated goals. His use of Mohg demonstrates a willingness to manipulate and discard others for his own ends. His resurrection of Radahn shows disregard for others' autonomy and choice. His abandonment of Saint Trina reveals that he valued power over the very love and compassion his age was meant to embody. By the time he reached the gate of divinity, Miquella had become the antithesis of everything his age of compassion supposedly represented. Some might argue that this corruption wasn't intentional, that Miquella's path required these sacrifices, and he mourned what he had to discard. But the memory sequences at his crosses show otherwise. Miquella made these choices deliberately, with full awareness of what he was doing. He didn't stumble into becoming a manipulative tyrant. He chose that path, convinced that the end goal justified any means necessary to achieve it. The parallels to Queen Marika herself become unavoidable. Marika achieved godhood and established the Golden Order, claiming to bring peace and prosperity to the lands between. And indeed, for those who fit within her order's narrow definitions of acceptable existence, there was stability and structure. But for Omen, for those who lived in death, for ancient dragons and giants, and all those who didn't conform, the Golden Order was tyrannical and cruel. Miquella's age of compassion would have been the same, just with a different facade. Instead of openly imposing order through power and hierarchy, it would impose order through charm and manipulation. Everyone would love their god and each other, but only because they were compelled to. Those who didn't fit the mold wouldn't be cast out or persecuted. They simply wouldn't be able to conceive of not fitting in. Their very thoughts and feelings adjusted by Miquella's influence to ensure compliance. In some ways, this is worse than the Golden Order's honest tyranny. At least, under the Golden Order, resistance was possible. Those who disagreed could oppose, could nurture their resentment, plan rebellion, could maintain their identity even while oppressed. Under Miquella's age of compassion, resistance would be impossible because the desire to resist would be charmed. Everyone would be happy, everyone would be content, and everyone would be imprisoned in that enforced happiness. Saint Trina's plea to stop Miquella makes complete sense in this context. She wasn't asking us to stop him out of revenge for being abandoned. She was asking us to prevent a nightmare dressed as paradise, to save everyone, including Miquella himself, from the cage he was building. The fact that Miquella's own love recognized his plan as fundamentally wrong is the strongest condemnation possible of what his age of compassion truly represented. The tragic element is that Miquella likely began with genuine good intentions. His efforts to help Melania, his mourning for Godwyn, his creation of the Erdtree as a sanctuary. These all suggest someone who truly did care about alleviating suffering. But somewhere along the way, the means he chose corrupted the ends he sought. The power to charm others became not just a tool, but the foundation of his entire vision. And once he decided that achieving godhood required discarding his love, the corruption was complete. Conclusion: hero, villain, or tragic figure. As we reach the end of this deep examination of Miquella's master plan, we must return to our central question. Was Miquella the Kind a hero trying to save a broken world through compassion, or a manipulator using divine charm to impose his will on everyone? The answer, as with so many things in Elden Ring's rich narrative, resists simple categorization. The evidence for Miquella as a genuine hero is substantial. He created unalloyed gold to help those suffering from outer god influence. He bled himself for years to grow the Erdtree as a sanctuary. He crafted prayers for his dead brother and prosthetics for his afflicted sister. He rejected the Golden Order's cruel hierarchies and sought to create a world where all beings would be accepted, regardless of how they were born. These are not the actions of a pure villain or cynical manipulator. But the evidence for Miquella as a manipulator is equally compelling and perhaps more disturbing. He charmed Mohg and used him as an unwitting tool for years. He forced Radahn's resurrection against the general's will, binding him to a vow made in youth. He deliberately discarded his own love and compassion to achieve godhood. He planned to build his age of compassion on a foundation of compulsion and control, imposing affection and harmony on people who would have no choice in the matter. Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Miquella was a tragic figure, someone who began with genuine heroism and noble intentions, but whose pursuit of power gradually corrupted those ideals until he became a reflection of the tyranny he opposed. The Empyrean who watered the Erdtree with his blood was not the same being who reached the gates of divinity. Somewhere along the journey, through accumulating compromises and sacrifices, Miquella lost sight of what he was fighting for. The turning point likely came when Miquella decided that achieving godhood was necessary to enact his vision. Once he committed to that path, everything else became justified as means to that end. Using Mohg wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Resurrecting Radahn wasn't violation, it was fulfilling a promise. Discarding Saint Trina wasn't abandoning his better nature, it was removing an obstacle to achieving the power needed to help everyone. This rationalization is what makes Miquella's story so tragic. He genuinely believed, perhaps until the very end, that he was working towards something good. The age of compassion he envisioned probably seemed, from his perspective, worth any cost. Everyone would be happy. All suffering would end. The cycles of violence and persecution would finally break. That this happiness would be compelled, this peace enforced, these cycles broken through control rather than understanding. These truths became invisible to him once he shed his doubt and love. Saint Trina's final plea illuminates this tragedy most clearly. She recognized what Miquella himself could no longer see, that godhood achieved through discarding compassion cannot create an age of genuine compassion. that peace imposed through charm is not true peace, that a world where everyone loves their god only because they're compelled to is a prison, not a paradise. And because Miquella had removed the parts of himself that might have understood this, he couldn't hear her warning. The parallels to real-world authoritarians who claim to act for the greater good are striking. History is full of leaders who genuinely believed they were helping people while implementing oppressive systems. Miquella's Age of Compassion would have been particularly insidious because of this disconnect, a system that felt benevolent to those under its influence, where subjects loved their oppression because they were compelled to, where resistance was impossible because the very desire to resist was charmed away. In this sense, Miquella represents perhaps the most dangerous kind of tyrant, one who acts from conviction rather than cynicism, who truly believes in their own righteousness, who cannot be swayed by appeals to compassion or morality because they've literally excised those qualities from themselves. The Golden Order was cruel, but at least it could be opposed. Miquella's age would have been kind, and that mandated kindness would have been far more totalitarian. Yet we cannot forget the genuine good that Miquella accomplished. The unalloyed gold needles continued to help people long after his death. The Erdtree still stands as a sanctuary, even if Miquella abandoned it. His research into fundamentalism and divine law advanced understanding in ways that could benefit future generations. And his core insight that the world's existing order was fundamentally unjust and needed to be changed was completely correct. This is what makes judgment so difficult. Miquella identified a real problem, developed some genuine solutions, and then went too far in pursuing a complete fix. He wasn't wrong about the Golden Order's cruelty or the need for an alternative. He was wrong about the methods, wrong to think that compulsion could create genuine compassion, wrong to believe that sacrificing his own humanity would help him save humanity. The various NPCs we encounter throughout the game and expansion reflect this complexity. Melania never stopped believing in her brother, waiting faithfully for his return, even as he pursued plans she wasn't part of. Sir Ansbach came to oppose Miquella's final plan, but spoke of him with respect, acknowledging both his accomplishments and his crimes. Talier's faith shattered when he learned the truth, unable to reconcile his devotion to Saint Trina with the reality of what Miquella had done to his other self. These varied reactions mirror our own conflicted understanding. Miquella cannot be easily categorized as purely hero or villain. He was both and neither, someone whose story serves as a warning about how noble intentions can corrupt into tyranny when pursued without moral restraint, about how the pursuit of power transforms even the most compassionate into controllers and manipulators. The fact that we must kill him to stop his plan adds another layer of tragedy. Miquella was an Empyrean, a being of immense power and potential. His intelligence and capability could have continued making genuine, positive contributions to the world. But because he chose a path that required him to discard his own compassion, because his plan threatened to impose compelled harmony on everyone. He had to be stopped, and stopping him meant ending all the good he might have yet accomplished, along with preventing the harm his age would have caused. St. Trina's final words, that godhood would be Miquella's prison, resonate throughout this analysis. She understood that what Miquella was becoming was worse than what he was, that the curse of eternal childhood was preferable to the cage of loveless godhood. In granting Miquella death, we are performing an act of compassion that his age of compassion never could have. We are respecting his autonomy and his other self's judgment enough to end his existence rather than allow him to become a monster. The broader question of whether any age can be truly just remains open. The Golden Order was oppressive. Miquella's age of compassion would have been controlling. The Age of Stars removes divine guidance entirely, leaving people to face uncertainty without higher purpose. The Frenzied Flame destroys everything. Perhaps the lesson is that no single vision, no matter how well-intentioned or carefully planned, can serve all people's needs without becoming tyrannical. Miquella's story ultimately serves as a meditation on power, consent, and the corruption of ideals. It asks us to consider, at what point does helping people cross the line into controlling them? When does a vision for a better world become tyranny? How do we balance the real need for change against the dangers of imposing our vision on others? These questions don't have easy answers, which is precisely what makes Miquella such a compelling and tragic figure. As players, we're left to draw our own conclusions about Miquella's true nature and whether his fate was deserved or tragic. The game provides enough evidence to support multiple interpretations, respecting our intelligence and allowing us to engage with these complex moral questions on our own terms. Some will see Miquella primarily as a victim of his own ambition, others as a manipulator who got what was coming to him. Both perspectives are valid, and both miss something of the complete picture. What's certain is that Miquella the Kind, Miquella the Unalloyed, Miquella the Fearsome Empyrean, all these titles and more applied to a being whose story encompasses both genuine heroism and disturbing manipulation, authentic compassion and cold control. He was a character who challenged us to think deeply about morality, power, and the dangerous roads paved with good intentions. And in the end, whether we see our final battle with him as a triumph over tyranny or a tragic necessity, we've participated in preventing an age that promised compassion but would have delivered only compulsion. Perhaps that's the clearest truth we can arrive at, that genuine compassion cannot be forced, that real kindness requires choice, and that any age built on overriding free will, no matter how benevolent it claims to be, must be opposed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Miquella's master plan and the moral complexity at the heart of Shadow of the Erdtree, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We have many more lore explorations planned, examining the rich narratives and philosophical questions that make games like Elden Ring so endlessly fascinating. Share your own thoughts on Miquella in the comments. Was he a hero, a villain, or something more complex? I'd love to hear your perspectives on this tragic Empyrean and the age of compassion that never was. Until next time, sleep well, Tarnished.